way to the top. We got so far to go, even farther back to home. So many times we could have stopped when we got stuck in the mud and we felt like giving up. But this is our road, and y'all are my people. No matter where we go, never alone. No, we're not gonna stop till we get to the peak. Going high, 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 gonna fly through the ether.
Hello, and welcome to Notes from the Healing Field, a safe space for self-healers to explore their own journey. I am Krista Xiomara, your host and guide. The intention of this podcast is to create an open source spiritual classroom for every sentient being who's navigating the human experience. Together, we will examine themes of awakening, healing, and integration. We will use our curiosity as our guide on this path of expansion and compassion as our compass. All the information shared is open source and free to everyone and is intended to support the collective awakening and liberation of humanity in harmony with our highest shared desire for peace on earth. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Let's get into it. Hello, welcome back to Notes from the Healing Field podcast. Super excited to have you guys here today. Episode 4, we are going to be talking about the ego, the identity, and the story. So these are 3 things that are incredibly important on our spiritual journey to come into contact with and awareness with. So last week we actually talked about self-awareness and how we use self-awareness on the path of healing and personal development and integration and why we need that. So if you have not heard of the ego, which I'm sure you have, it's sort of in our popular language vernacular as a society, and the more people get comfortable with psychology, they understand this term. I want to define that the actual definition by Webster's is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. There are many different camps about what the ego is, what it's for, why do we have one, what we're supposed to do with it, and even if we should consider even giving our ego the time of day. And sometimes your ego can feel like another person, so that can feel weird. If you've ever experienced that sort of third-party observation about your own ego. So what I want to say to you about the different camps, about the different ideas, is I want you to figure out for yourself, to critically think for yourself about how you feel about the ego and what you think about it. So I'm not here to tell you what the ego is or my opinion about it or my my thoughts on it. This is just specifically for you to figure out what your ego is to you, how it interacts with you, and how you're interacting with your own ego. But what I do want to say is I want to focus this episode on how our ego keeps us trapped and how it's motivated and how it's usually motivated by an identity, a narrative, or a story, which is why we're calling this episode The Ego, the Identity, and the Story. And the reason why we want to unpack those 3 things is because they can keep us very stuck. So when we're doing our own self-healing, we have to have a contemplative practice where we sort of remove ourselves a degree from ourselves to be able to look at ourselves with clear objectivity, compassion, and with kindness, and then sort of pick apart what needs to be revisited, what is not working for us. Is there harmful, negative aspects of our personality or stories that we're telling ourselves that are drawing us away from ourselves? And one of those big things is the ego. So we want to talk about why this is important in self-healing. I do want to call attention to, in the notes, I want to link a really important podcast interview I did with a Buddhist monk named Flint Sparks, who has the coolest name ever. On my other podcast, I'm Awake Now What? Years ago, he did a podcast with me, and he has this theory of growing up and waking up, and those 2 things together, and how they sort of support us on our spiritual journey and how those two things are correlated with each other. And it's important in terms of thinking about that with your ego as well. Sometimes we don't actually have the maturity yet or the self-awareness yet to see things as they are, and that's okay. And we have to be patient and kind with ourselves throughout that journey. Okay, so I want you guys to go check that interview out. I will link it in the show notes. Okay, so the ego. One of the best descriptions I ever heard of the ego was from the beautiful Brene Brown, who, if you don't know who she is, just stop what you're doing right now and go check everything out. Buy every book she's ever written. She's amazing. She said that the ego is like a hustler. And I don't think there's a better description for it. I feel my ego trying to hustle all the time. And I'm like, girl, you got to back it up. Okay. So when I think about the ego, I always think about how it's motivated to elevate us and to keep us identified with the story, a persona, a status, and just also just our general outward view of how society looks at us. So a lot of us, our egos are motivated by financial status. It's motivated by our physical beauty. It's motivated by our intellectual prowess, all of the things. And the way we identify with those things, or the way our ego identifies with those things, it tells us something about who we think we are. So I want you just to remember that, because we're going to unpack that a little bit more. So when I talk about not being able to see things clearly, one thing that's I would say in my experience, is the ego can't always see us clearly either. And this is very important to think about, and just to sit with that just for a little bit and think, if I can't see myself clearly and neither can my ego, what does that mean for me exactly? So it's important for us to think about that, and also think about how, if our ego cannot see us clearly, is it possible that it's protecting us from something? Is it afraid of something? Is it trying to curate a reality for us that keeps us safe, small, whatever these adjectives are for you? And it could be shielding us from a variety of things. So I want you to think about, in your life, as you start to work with your ego, what do you think that it is motivated by? What do you think it's trying to protect you from? What do you think it's trying to shield you from? What do you think it's trying to show the world about you that could be potentially exaggerated or under-exaggerated? These are all things to really think about. Now, our ego loves a good story. Our ego loves a good story about us that creates an identity of who we think we are, or who we think other people think we are. And sometimes this story can be negative, sometimes it can be positive. Honestly, I don't think the ego really cares. I think it just wants to be identified with something to say, I'm this. And another great resource I'll put in here is when we think about treating our ego as a different part of ourselves, not the core of who we are. And we'll get to that in these episodes. As each of these episodes build on each other, we're trying to pull out all of the excess stuff that isn't us, bit by bit, in this self-healing journey, and going along the journey with identifying the ego and our parts, which is the resource I'll put in there, internal family systems. It's also a great place to find some grounding in how you understand yourself as an individual, but who you are at the core of your being. That's super, super important. I will link that in the notes, and we will definitely at some point talk about it. So when we think about our self-healing journey, part of that journey is to start questioning the story and the identities that we've become comfortable portraying in our lives and living into those. And oftentimes some of those identities and those narratives and those stories are put on to us by other people, our family dynamics, our work situations. And usually, not always, but a lot of the times, the stories that we get, that our ego gets identified with, are things that make us feel good about ourselves. And where that gets tricky and gets a little risky is if that thing gets taken away from us, it can shatter our whole sense of being. So like, let's say, for instance, you're a professional athlete and your entire life has been around your physicality and these beautiful moments in your life that get you gold medals and all of the things, and you break your leg and you can no longer do those things. But who are you if you're not that professional athlete? And so your ego would get really tied to that, and you could have a very dark night of the soul if you don't know who you are without all of the extra stuff. So a lot to think about there. And we create the space to think about what our ego is saying to us, and we can contemplate what's really true for us, who we are at the core of our being, which is the question we should always be asking ourselves. Who am I? If I'm not a mother, if I'm not a student, if I'm a vice president of this, if I don't drive a Lamborghini, if I am a model, or I'm not someone who's, or if I'm someone who's super thin, or I'm really smart, like who am I if I'm not all those things? Like all of us have running the risk of being disidentified from the things that we think we are. So creating that space gives us leverage to be able to choose also a different outcome, which is what I want to call attention to in this episode for you, because we want to create that internal healing. And those experiences and those past experiences that are presented by your ego, they want to hold on to that story and that identity that, truly isn't you. So we want to untangle ourselves from that, which is really interesting to think about. Okay, so I've said a lot of general things here, but I want to give you like a specific example from my past life. So we've got the theory of like what our ego is doing. It's grabbing onto all these stories and it's thinking about, who am I? I'm the girl who always gets the best job, the best boyfriend, whatever your story is. Okay, so we want to be thinking about what that is, and you want to also remember that we all have multiple stories. So we're not just the one thing, but it's how we're identifying to those things. The example I want to give to you is I garnished early on in my career, a lot of my self-approval, I would say, and external approval from how hard I worked and how quickly I climbed the corporate ladder and how much money I made and all of the things. And that's a different story, but it ties into this one about work that I'm going to tell you about. Early on in my career, I ran into this 3-year cycle where I was in conflict and in toxic work situations with bosses and coworkers and generally negative work environments. And I truly didn't understand why this kept happening. And I truly started feeling sorry for myself. I got very depressed and I didn't want to go to work. And I was wondering, like, why do these situations and these things keep playing out? Like, what is going on here? And despite me giving all of my efforts and trying to stay positive, like year after year, it was still going on. And I was like, this is crazy. I have to find a way out of this. Like, what is going on? And at the height of this cycle, I was confronted with this very dark and heavy work situation that required me to like literally stand up for myself and fight back, not physically, but through facts, verbally, and engage a series of other people and situations to help hear me out and really find a way through this. And it wasn't until after I had fought back in this scenario, and I had the hindsight of the situation, I would say like a couple months later, because everything changed. My work situation changed, my relationship with my coworkers changed, my work environment changed, everything was better. And I thought to myself, I see here that really what was going on was that I was victimizing myself in this situation. And I was feeling sorry for myself. And I also in some ways really enjoyed being able to complain about the things that were happening about me and being like, oh, woe is me, this is happening to me. And my ego loved that as well. My ego loved being identified with this thing. And I think it's very easy for us also to get caught up in the negativity of life sometimes. It's so weird that that's a thing in our human nature. I feel like a lot of us sometimes prefer to stay in a negative situation. I definitely have felt that in my past. The other thing is that I mistakenly perceived that people around me and in higher levels of the organization, and my perceived idea that because they were in higher levels and positions than me, that they probably had more self-awareness, more maturity, and truly they actually did not. And so I was expecting them to take the proper and appropriate and correct action, and they didn't. I needed to, because they couldn't do that. And I think a lot of us, like, we get caught in the power dynamics, especially in work relationships and familial relationships, and we forget sometimes we have to advocate for ourselves. So in that situation, I needed to advocate for myself. I needed to get myself out of this self-pity cycle. I needed to find a different outcome. And I needed my ego to stop identifying with this victimized mentality in that moment. So I had to do two really uncomfortable things. I had to, number one, confront myself and really see what was going on here. And number two, I had to have the uncomfortable realization that I had given my power away for 3 years, essentially. I just thought I have to take this behavior, the situation, these odd work experiences that I don't think are appropriate. And I really needed to have boundaries and have boundaries with my boss and coworkers. And I needed to address the fact that this was an unhealthy dynamic that I was participating in as well. And I think one of the things that I want to call your attention to is, like, it's so hard in the human experience as you start to grow up and wake up, which why I really want you guys to go listen to Flint's podcast interview, is because there is this point in when we create our own internal healing, we become healthy, we become super centered, we have more compassion for ourselves and the world around us, and we recognize that we have to prioritize our own well-being, which means we have to challenge power dynamics, we have to challenge society dynamics, relationship dynamics, we have to push and pull, we've got to create boundaries, so that we don't incur any more injury that our ego gets tied to. And I want to also underline here that, like, the things that happen to us are all real and all valid. So we're not trying to invalidate those experiences at all. We're just saying we can't get tied to those experiences forever as our identity. That's what we want to say here. So being able to see with, like, crystal clarity that you might have to be the strong person and fight back or challenge, and within reason. Okay. So I'm not saying, like, go all in there guns a-blazing or, like, have your facts together. And you might have an uncomfortable conversation with your family members about boundaries, or uncomfortable conversations with your partner if they're criticizing you and you don't want to feel like that anymore. You can apply this situation to whatever you're going through or have gone through. And this is how we start to heal. And we also start to take back the narrative of who we are, because those victimized versions of ourselves are not actually who we are. But our ego loves that. Our ego will always get us entangled in that. And mostly those are all out of fear as well. So we want to step away from that. And before I challenged and really bumped up against the situation and really found my voice and my truth in it, I could feel my ego prodding me with a lot of fear. Like, if we say anything, we could lose our job, we could lose our livelihood, we could lose our house. Like, there were real legitimate fears that my ego was trying to tell me, don't rock the boat, just don't say anything, don't do anything. Even if it's the right thing to do, just don't. It's too scary. And I couldn't let my ego talk me out of the situation. I just knew something had to change. I was like, I can't live like this anymore. But anyways, to my surprise, after this thing happened, like I said, everything changed. And it was just like, it was almost like everybody needed a reset. You know, all of us involved in the situation, in the work environment, in the relationships with each other, we all needed a reset. And then shortly after that, I left that work environment, and I've never been in a situation like that again. And it's wonderful. It's great to be in a different space by having the clarity and the contemplative practice to see how we're contributing, where we can challenge, and what we can change. You know, that's what we want to do here. So that's my story about work. And I wanted to say one more thing about it. And I've said this in other podcast interviews and on my podcast. I think the irony of that situation and the irony of self-healing that is counterintuitive to what the world tells us to do, which is to look externally, to wait for somebody to save us, is that I came through that experience and I thought, I gave my power away. I wanted somebody to save me. And not only did I become my own angel, I saved myself, I got my power back, I spoke my truth, and I was the one who got myself out of that situation, not my ego, not anything else. And the more you can practice that in your life, the easier it'll be for you to I would say identify the core of who you are, and it's really important. And there's nothing we can't do. We have so much internal power and strength and resilience. And yeah, we may get kicked down a couple times. We may fall again. Like there may be situations where you try to fight back and it doesn't work. And sometimes the solution is just, to walk away or potentially find a different work situation. I'm not discounting any of those things that may create additional hardship. But what I want to call back to your attention is that you're in charge and that you have the power and the ability to create your own destiny as you're creating the self-healing and integrating really healthy patterns into your life. That's what we want to do here. This is what we're doing together in this moment. And you have the strength, you have the power, you have the ability, you have all the tools you need inside of yourself to say like, that's not working. This is not good for me. And what's good for me is X, Y, and Z, and identifying those things. So wrapping it up here, I want to talk about a couple things about looking at the internal narratives and the ego. It's important that you create some moments of space and time for you to have self-reflection, and in that self-reflection to have compassion. Because what I want to call your attention to here is that as we create more self-awareness in ourselves, sometimes we can feel shame by how we acted in the past. And it's important for you to remember that like you cannot apply what you know now to what you knew then. That's where the line of shame begins. And sometimes people want to like self-shame themselves into things. And we just can't. And it's kind of like, Maya Angelou said, when you know better, you do better. This doesn't always happen for most people, but if you're on the self-healing journey, 9 times out of 10, you're wanting to do better and to be better than wherever it was. So if you can look in your past when you're creating that contemplative practice of self-compassion and you go back in time and you recognize where you've been victimizing yourself or where you've been believing the stories or the narratives about who you are by the people around you and the people that surround you, you have to have a lot of patience and compassion and kindness towards that old version of you that now has more information and has more tools. And so we want to be very loving to ourselves when we're doing this practice. We want to be very kind and gentle. I cannot say that enough. You're going to probably get tired of hearing me say that, but it's the absolute and most honest truth we want to have with ourselves. And I do want to talk and underline just a little bit more too, is this idea of the stories that people tell us about ourselves. Because this one's a big one, and our ego loves to get tied into a story. And one place that you will often see it is in your family system. So Some of us are the baby. Some of us are the only child. Some of us are the oldest child. Some of us are the troublemakers. Some of us are the rebel. Some of us are the quiet one, the shy one. Blank, whatever it is you are in your family. This is a great place for you to investigate what your ego continues to tell you about the narrative that has been created by other people about you, and to start questioning, is this true? Am I that? In my family, I have two families, which I've talked about on my other podcast multiple times. I have a biological family where I am number 6 of 8, and then I have an adoptive family where I'm one of 3. In the one of 3, I'm the baby, and I'm also the rebel. I'm the black sheep. I'm the one who had a very big temper when she was young. And although I've changed and come home to myself, there is this perception of me like that with a little hot temper, and I just don't have it in me anymore. I know that. My family just hasn't updated their software about who I am. And that's okay. That's totally okay. That's like their own journey. So I want you to not get caught up in wanting to update other people's software as you change and go on the self-healing journey, because that can be energy wasted. That ain't nobody got time for that. So we're not going to do that. But I want you to recognize, if there are things that your family says about you that you know is not you anymore or was never you, that's a great place to go and discover what your ego is saying about it. And then how there's a story around it, and if it's creating any potential blocks or obstacles in your life. So one specific example might be, if your family always said that you were super independent, and maybe you are, part of you has a very independent streak, and you enjoy your own time and all the things, but you struggle in relationship. And part of that might be the story that you were told growing up. And maybe you can find partnership, wherever that may be and whatever that looks like, but on your own terms. It's not necessarily to say that you can't, right? But there's a story that was embedded in your mind when you were young, and that you were like this way, and that you're, because of that, you may not be suited for long-term relationships. So that would be the kind of lines, the dotted lines on that narrative that you would want to follow. So I hope these specific examples have helped you kind of understand where to look at the ego, where to look at the stories too, because that's very, very important. And then I want you guys to take some really small steps. Try to pick one story that you know for sure is not you, that your ego loves, okay? Find just one, because there will be many. Find just one, and I want you to take some very small steps into a different direction of that story, and find some real evidence for your ego, come with the facts, this is not me because A, B, and C. And then start practicing acting different and more of the core of who you are in whenever those situations present themselves. And then last but not least, and always, I want you to come back into your power. I want you to remember how powerful you are as a human being. I want us to always remember how powerful we are. I want you to close your eyes right now and just feel deeply in your heart center how powerful you are, how many choices you have, how creative you can get with manifesting the life that you need, how resilient you've been up into this moment, how many times you've made really hard decisions so that your well-being could be prioritized. That is all of your deep, deep inherited birthright power existing in your heart center. And I want you to think about that when you are doing this work. And I want you to remember your power always. And ain't nobody gonna take it away. Nobody. Nobody. All right, guys, I had a wonderful time with you today. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Make sure you head over to YouTube and subscribe over there. I'll be having some more bonus episodes that I'm excited to share with you guys. And thank you for doing this with me today. I love being able to share my own wisdom and experience and take on all of these beautiful topics around self-healing. I'm very passionate about making sure that however we need to share this information more, we should be doing that in our own lives and wherever it finds us, because the world is waking up in a really interesting way. Things are changing. Things are becoming a lot more dynamic, a lot more collective focused instead of controlled power balances. So there's so much exciting things that are coming down, I think, in the pipeline of humanity. And I'm just here as a teacher to help you through that journey and to make sure that as we evolve, and we all evolve together, and we do it in a really kind and compassionate and loving way that supports the collective, number one, and supports us, number two, and that we have fun doing it as well. All right, guys. Bye. This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Krista Xiomara, in alignment with Light Casting. Original song, Sword, composed and produced by Sing Kids, with lead vocals by X. Rack up some good karma by sharing this podcast with another self-healer. You can find Notes from the Healing Field on all social media channels and YouTube. Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, rate, and review.
All the small wins give us hope. Little signs to let us know that we're not so far away. Yeah, yeah. We're gonna make it to the goal. Cups dry, but our hearts are full. So let everybody